Good evening. Thank you for coming. Do you know what happens is you start off acting at school and you love it and it's a hobby and a wondrous thing to do, and you never believe for a second that you would be allowed to do something you enjoy quite so much as a trade. I started by when I was I'd done it at school and little professional things, as you said, workhouse boy number 43, I think.
Number 43?
Yes.
You got downgraded.
Exactly.
Yes.
/ book boy. I had one line. It went, books you ordered from the bookseller, sir. And I can still remember it. I'd got the bug from then, really. And what happens then is, or for me, was I started doing theatre in London. And I did a production of a play called The Goat, an Edward Albee play. And that play, it was with Jonathan Pryce, who randomly had played Fagin in Oliver when I was 11 years old. And when we did our first day of rehearsal for The Goat, I was like, actually, John, we've worked together before. And he said, really? I was like, yeah, I was in Oliver. And he went, really? What were you, Dodger, Oliver? I was like, I was workhouse boy number 43. He was like, forgive me for not remembering you. But
did you say books for the bookseller, sir?
I did. Do you remember that bit? He was like, no, unfortunately not. So that play was reviewed by Variety, the newspaper here, the industry paper, and it was through that review that a casting director called Amanda Mackie, who was casting a film called The Good Shepherd, which Robert De Niro was directing, she read that review, and when she came to London to cast The Good Shepherd, she called me in for a general meeting. And it was at that general meeting we were just sort of having a chat, and she said, I would like you to come back and to meet Bob.
So you mentioned Bob De Niro was directing that. As a young actor, when you're put in the position where you're working with somebody as hugely famous as that, how do you avoid the starstruck factor and just concentrate on the work?
If I'm being totally honest, I didn't. I mean, I had done, at that point, mainly theatre. I'd done, I think, one film, and the whole experience was overwhelming for me. You were put up in New York. There were sort of huge cars taking you to set every day in Brooklyn. There were thousands of paparazzi outside because Matt Damon and Angelina Jolie and all these, it was an amazing cast were in it. And then you would see these gigantic sets, just money everywhere in these sets, and then De Niro behind the camera, and then a camera on your face, and it was like action. And I've never felt fear like it, and I really didn't know what I was doing, and it was an amazing learning curve, because I sort of, fortunately, the character had to be quite scared for quite a lot of the film, but I look back on that film and just see rigid
He's
fear.
a natural.
Exactly. No, I'm pretty sure I was only cast because I have oversized lips, or big lips, and I was playing Angelina's, who has amazing lips, her son, so I was very lucky for that. But really, it was an incredibly lucky break.
And then from Hollywood to Broadway, talk us through your experience in Red alongside Alfred Molina, your Tony-winning role on that. How completely terrifying or daunting was it? How rewarding was it as an actor to be, at the ultimate on Broadway?
That whole experience of that play was amazing for me. It was one of those things where at that time I'd done a few films in England and some TV that had... I find this thing that you always pour your heart into everything, and sometimes it doesn't work, and it often doesn't work, and there's this alchemy, this thing that we can't really find a formula for, that either makes something live or doesn't, but that doesn't take away from the amount of work that was put into it. And I'd had a few things that hadn't worked, and yet you'd lived away for a long time, and away from your family, from your friends, and I was a bit disheartened. And then Michael Grandage, who's one of my favourite directors, theatre directors in London, I went for a general meeting with him, and he said, what do you want to do? And I was like, I couldn't believe that I hadn't come to this meeting with an idea or anything. I was so sort of, and he said, I sort of said, Shakespeare? It's the least original response anyone's ever given to. And he said, well, actually, maybe, but here is a play that's just been given to me. It's about Mark Rothko, and I want to do it. It's a two-hander. Will you go and have a read of it? Now, I studied history of art at university, as you said before. The play was about art, commerce, the complications of that life, and I went to the Covent Garden Hotel. I read it straight after the meeting, and I called him up. I actually saw him that evening as I'm in, and it was the sort of an agent's worst nightmare, because I called all my agents going, by the way, in 7 months' time, I'm doing a play at the Donwell Warehouse for 300 quid a week for a couple of weeks, and they were like, really? But how are we going to schedule things around that? But it was an absolute no-brainer. And in the end, it was with Alfred Molina, who is the loveliest human being in the world, and also a formidable actor. And we went through this. It was a real passion project. And when we arrived in New York, it had done okay in London, but we arrived in New York, and it was a small theatre, the Golden Theatre, and it was one of those things. I remember I went to see another play just as we were rehearsing, and someone was there saying, I can't get a ticket for your play till June. And I was like, oh, that's great. Clearly we're doing okay. And when we started rehearsal, I said to Michael, I met someone who couldn't get a ticket till June. He goes, that's absolute bollocks. We haven't sold a single ticket. We're closing in a week. And that was riveting to me, that on Broadway, compared to London, finance and how plays are doing, and it being published in newspapers, and and the expense of putting on plays is so much more extreme. So we started as a play that really no one really knew about, and it built, and it was the absolute dream, both artistically and just for life-wise. We had so much fun.
Now, what advice do you have for actors to keep going and keep the spirits up? When the phone isn't ringing and the work dries up.
I think for me, it's been about really enjoying the process around it. And so whether that is an audition that you have, I always describe it as this thing of being like, I was one of those people that if at school you were asked to write an essay and people said, go and choose the title yourself, I was always useless at it. I was like, give me a title and I'll be able to go and focus myself on. And what I love about what we do is that you get to go in and dip into entirely different worlds. And I always sort of treated each audition a bit like a job. You would go and immerse yourself in that world for a bit. But also, I think what's shifted since I started working is technology. And so now you can tape yourself. And I always say to young actors, from when I started acting professionally at 21 after leaving university, I only did theatre. I didn't get a job on screen for about 4 or 5 years. And my first ever film was with Tony Collette, and I was playing this psychopath. And we were in Australia, and it was a sort of wannabe Silence of the Lambs relationship. And we had our first scene. I was sitting opposite her doing this scene, trying my hardest to play psycho. And it was a first-time director, and the director had said, you can't watch playback. And I didn't really even know what playback was. And after about an hour of shooting with Tony, she said, should we go and watch playback? And I was like, no, I'm not allowed. And she went, no, come watch playback. And I was like, no, the director said I really can't. She's like, come and watch playback. And thank God I did, because I was like performing to the back of the stalls. My eyebrows were going insane. I didn't know what screen acting was. And I do think that over the years, I know so many actors who go, I don't watch my work, and God, I respect that, and it can be painful or irritating watching your own work, but I've had to learn from my mistakes. And I think now with the technology of iPhones and being able to film yourself and really then scrutinize that and work out what you're doing. But so that would be one side. The other thing would be get something from the process, whether it's auditioning or immersing yourself in a world around it. Make sure you're gleaning stuff that's beyond just the specifics.
Tell us how you go about pursuing roles, because it's a big competition out there. So how do you put yourself ahead of the pack? I'm thinking of great roles you got, like in My Week with Marilyn and Les Miserables. How did you make those yours?
I've always found that the great bit of audition advice I ever got was from Joe Wright, and I'd done many years of going to auditions, nervous, leaving the room, frustrated at having given an eighth of what I felt I could give. And he described how when he went to America to audition for some of the sisters in Pride and Prejudice, how he'd found it a completely different experience to that he had had in London. And he said that in America, the actor ran the room. So some of these actors would come in and go, do you know what, I'm so sorry, I'm really nervous, can I just run the lines? And Joe found this a bit like, okay, yep, we'll go ahead. And they did, and then they would say, good, I'm good to go, can I, and they would do a take, and then if they weren't happy with it, halfway through, they'd go, no, sorry, can I just try that again, can I start again? And he said to begin with, it was a bit sort of overwhelming. But what was wonderful was that most of the people left having at least demonstrated an ounce of what they could do. Whereas back in England, people like me were just walking out going, I wish I had given some. And when I heard that, it totally changed the way in which I approached auditions. I sort of said to myself, I'm not going to leave a room. Don't get me wrong, I've done some really awful auditions, but at least I'll have given something that's relatively close to what I think I could do. I believe that those things that really hit you, you pursue. And certainly, and even if you blindly pursue them, not really knowing whether you can do it or not. With Les Miserables, I'd seen it as a kid. I'd wanted to be Gavroche, the guy on the little kid on the barricades, and the idea that they were making that film when I was at an age that potentially I could even audition for it was amazing. So I did that thing of recording yourself on an iPhone, sending it to my agent, who then sent it to Eric Fellner at Working Title, and that was the start of that process. And similarly with my work with Marilyn, I was doing Red actually, and I filmed myself in my dressing room there, and then you just give everything you make it an investment. With Savage Grace, I remember flying over 4 or 5 times to New York to try and win that role, and when your heart's in it, there's no question that you go for it.
Your career has been a real example of versatility. How much of that was by accident and how much by design? Is there a particular kind of role that you're looking for?
No, I love kind of what I was saying with the essay title thing. I love just being said, how about that? And I never would have thought that I could play Stephen Hawking. I read this script and I thought it was going to be a biopic of Stephen's life, and what I read was this incredibly sort of passionate love story about 2 formidable people. And again, I really didn't believe that I could do it, but you do that thing that you do in a job interview, which is try and persuade people that you're really confident and you know what you're doing, and because of course you have to, because you never believe you're actually going to get the job. But and the worst thing is the moment when you do get the job and you have a moment of euphoria, and then you realize that you've told them all these things and you now have to kind of put your money where your mouth is. And
so are you saying that actors should run towards roles that frighten them?
For me, I've always found it helpful. I've always found those roles that are much further from me, in which you have to take a sort of bigger leap, tend to invigorate me more in the process. And because you're taking such a big leap, you're kind of just you're willing to expose yourself in a way that you wouldn't perhaps if you're pulling something closer to you, because you're going, well, this is all or nothing.
I know you've talked a lot about the physical transformation, but looking back on it now, what surprised you most about the acting challenge? Something that maybe when you were going into this, you didn't really expect it would be that intense.
I think the most challenging thing was having to have an eye outside of you on this job, because playing Stephen, you could do everything could feel right, in the sense that you'd done all the work on the specifics of the physicality, and then you could be playing it emotionally. But if the camera wasn't in the right place, or the costume wasn't quite fitting, or that specific day, the lighting wasn't working, James Marsh, the director, gave us, Felicity and I, the capacity to watch the dailies every day, and it was very unique to this film, but it was so important because you needed to continually scrutinize your own work in order to make sure that it was melding, because we didn't shoot chronologically. You were having to jump between playing Stephen at different points in his life within the same day, and yet motor neuron disease is a disease in which once muscles stop working, they don't start again. So you had to be concise, and so having that other eye outside of me was something which I hadn't had before, and I did find it interesting, but it was very, very specific.
You are next going on to another challenging role, playing a transgender woman in Tom Hooper's new film. Tell us what appealed to you about that challenge and how on earth you're going to approach it.
This is a film called The Danish Girl, and it was a film that Tom actually sent me when we were doing Les Miserables. I'd done a film or TV piece with Tom. One of the first things I ever did, actually before The Good Shepherd, was called Elizabeth with Helen Mirren. And so he's been a pal since then, and during Les Mis he sent me the script, and it's this extraordinary true story about this couple who were artists in Copenhagen in the 1920s, Einar and Gerda Wehner, and he was a very successful landscape artist, and she was a portraitist and magazine illustrator, but he had much more success. And then through various circumstances, he started dressing as a woman, and she started painting him as Lily. But what's interesting is it became a very complex artistic. She had been less successful, and there had been a certain amount of artistic competition between them, and suddenly she was finding her voice, her artistic voice, through painting Lily. Meanwhile, Lily did end up transitioning and becoming a woman, and a formidable woman, but it was at a time in which surgery wasn't an option. It was maybe the first, probably the first ever trans operation. And it was, it's a story about, it's an extraordinary love story, but a story about identity and self. And it was just it was sort of overwhelming when I read it. It was that thing that you can't read. It was like reading Red or reading Theory of Everything. Something in your gut reacts. Alfred Molina always puts it beautifully, that he says he starts reading a script and then you get to a point in the page where you suddenly feel sick, and that's because you realize you've got to do it, but you don't know how you're going to do it. So it was that sort of feeling. So I'm just starting preparation on it at the moment, and I've been meeting people from the trans community and really researching about the period as well, because it was a very specific time. And yep, so that starts in a few weeks. I should definitely be rehearsing rather than...
Well, hang on for just at least 20 more minutes, please, Eddie.
Sweating now at the prospect. Thank you for bringing it up.
Do you think, then, that all the intense research you did on Theory of Everything has maybe changed the way you approached roles, now that every sort of role will have to be like that? You mentioning interviewing people from the transgender community for this new one. I mean, it's certainly a career-changing experience for you, Theory of Everything, but has it sort of changed you as an actor in any way in terms of your preparation or discipline?
I think that something comes with playing someone who's living, that the stakes are higher, so you perhaps work even harder, but the actual process hasn't changed. I mean, when I was doing Birdsong, I was speaking to army officers, contemporary army officers, hearing their experience, doing the research around that world. It's always been what I've loved doing, because that's the human part of it that's enjoyable. It's like it educates you as a person alongside the work itself. Process-wise, what I got an extraordinary benefit from on the Theory of Everything was I worked with a dancer, a woman who was actually in that video before, called Alexandra Reynolds. And she and I went through a lot of the experience of meeting people with ALS and going to the clinic, the neurology clinic in London together. And working with a dancer was riveting, because quite often on film, I find directors can be, often they'll go, oh, be careful of giving too much now, because you've got to save that for the close-up, or and dancers, I remember Alex turning to me going, God, they let you off lightly. And I was like, really? She goes, yeah, if you screw it up in dance, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again until you get it right. And I loved that. And she had that rigor, because we had been through this sort of rehearsal process together and knew the specifics of Stephen's illness really quite intimately. There would be bits in which perhaps it looked like it was all good, and I sort of go, how was that? That relationship I found very, really wonderful, and one that I hope to take on.
Well, I hope you'll find the audience questions really wonderful as you prepare to take them on. We're going to take the questions in the order that we see them. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And we have Stephanie on that side, Natalie at that side with a roaming microphone. Just time for a few questions. So let's see those hands. If you have a question for Eddie. Yes, at the very back there. Thank you.
Do you find that your preparation, your research, helps you cut down on the nervousness and helps you deliver the performance that you want?
That's a really interesting question. I feel like it must in some ways, but I'm quite a nervous performer. I think that the most complicated thing about film acting is that the greatest performances happen when you're at your most relaxed, and yet everything about the circumstance of a film set is incredibly unrelaxing. You know, you have hundreds of people behind, kind of what I was saying with The Good Shepherd, you know, all this money and everything, and then there's this lens in front of you, and I think part of the real the thing that I'm always working on as an actor is I can be totally relaxed, and then I can hear the word action, and even if it looks that something in my stomach just tightens and tenses, you know, and learning either to use that or to sort of to kid yourself not into feeling that. Like, I've worked with actors who will literally be talking about. I remember working with one American actress, and it was a really intense scene we were about to do, and the cameras were sort of rolling, and you could see the director wanting to call action, and she was talking about the Jonathan Ross show. And I was sort of trying to be in my zone. I was going, wait, really? We're talking about the Jonathan Ross? And you could see, you could see that the director was going, and eventually he called action, and she just went straight into the character. And I was sort of sitting there, sort of trying to respond to the Jonathan Ross show chat, and I was like, oh God, she's acting. So, you know, and that technique is a lot about, throwing yourself into thinking you're relaxed in order that you can appear relaxed. But one of the things that both Felicity and I found on this job is both of us had worked over here and with directors who had improvisational techniques. And one director called Derek Martini, who I'd worked with, did this thing that after you'd shot the master shot, the second you were in close-ups, after 1 or 2 takes, he would have the actor off camera basically mess with the other actor, in character, out of character, just sort of screwing with them in order that the actor in front of camera had to keep balance and always had to be on their toes. And there were really bad moments that came from that, but some really interesting ones. And Felicity had worked in a similar way. And so when we came to do Theory of Everything, James allowed us the freedom to go. There's this one scene in which we're playing croquet, and Stephen's trying to keep it together. He's just been diagnosed, and he's a bit all over the place. And it was our second day of filming. And Felicity and I talked about this process. And so when it got to my close-up, I said, look, will you just sit behind the camera, or stand behind the camera, and just shout abuse at me? Just like, go for it, you know, really go. And we'd been friends for 10 years, so we sort of trusted each other. And she went for the jugular, and the point was I was trying to sort of keep it together, like, you know, while she was saying all this stuff. Anyway, it worked, but what was hilarious is the poor crew had no idea what was going on. They were like, this is day 2 of like a 2-month shoot, and these people loathe each other. They're literally screaming the most aggressively random things at each other. But that
Tell me that's on the DVD as an extra.
Well, hopefully it might make the bloopers. But I think we got calls from Eric Fellner going, "Is everything okay?"
Thank you.
Over on this side, please.
Hi, you mentioned the differences in auditioning here and auditioning in the UK. I was just wondering, since you've worked on both, you know, in both places, whether there were any other differences in terms of production, material, just energy and stuff like that.
Craft service.
There isn't any in England.
It doesn't exist in England. And here it's like you have to drag me away from the craft service. I'm like, my God, look at the bagel stand. Like, no, is there hours? I mean, the unions. I'll never forget. When we were doing Les Miserables, I was on an equity contract, and there were American actors on it on the SAG contract. And I remember I would be in at 5 in.the morning with all the guys from the guys who were playing the students, and then Aaron, wonderful American actor who was playing Enjolras, would arrive at sort of 10, and I was going, God, I've got to get that SAG thing going down.
So now do you go in at 10?
No, absolutely not. No, because interestingly, I was SAG then, but I wasn't hired on a SAG contract. So it is interesting, those the differences. What else? No, I mean, the only thing that I would say is just, because all the films I've shot in the States, I've shot in New Orleans, I've shot in North Carolina, in New York, but I did do some shooting for Jupiter Ascending here in Warner Brothers, and that was kind of the dream. I was dressed in a sort of huge sci-fi sequins number, and they were like, guys with prosthetics with two heads like walking past, and then you've got the tourists going past and their Warner Brothers train, and I was like, this is the dream. But I'm sure that's not really answering your question. No is probably the answer. There aren't many different.
Yeah, tell us more about the experience of working with the Wachowskis, because that's got to be quite an experience on Jupiter Ascending.
Do you know, it was wonderful. I had long admired Lana and Andy, and when I was auditioning for them, it was one of those scenarios, you know, it's getting so frustrating. It's getting more and more complicated when you're auditioning for things to even get to read a script. And nothing makes me more angry than turning up for an audition in which you've only been sent 2 sides, and you do the audition for the casting director, and then you get told nothing, and you leave again, and you're like, well, it's called acting, you know. You need some context, some. But with Lana and Andy, we were allowed to read the script. It was hyper top secret, and so we had to go. I remember going to a broom cupboard in Soho in London, and I'm like a really slow reader, and I was given sort of 2.5 hours to read their script. But when you read their scripts, they're like sort of these huge opus, you know, this with intricate things about entire different races and sort of half-breeds and, you know, all this sort of stuff. And I'd only got to about page 4 after about 3 hours. So I sort of had to skim through all the... But when I went to audition for them, what I loved was how different it was from something like the Hawking experience. You know, when you turn up there for something, you're very specific and real. When I arrived to audition for Lana and Andy, I was playing this tycoon baron out in space who's a kind of pretty bad character, and I did one reading, and I remember Lana just throwing out just saying, try something. She gave me, I think her direction was play it like an accountant, she said. And I was like, that's amazing. I don't know what I did with that, but it was like, and then try playing it like a, you know, and there were such extreme directions, but you left the audition going, I've nailed it, but going, I have no idea what I just did, but I know I did 7 completely different takes. And that was what the experience with working with them was like. I was kind of, I'm useless at, I have a shoddy imagination, so the idea of doing a lot of green screen is kind of my worst nightmare, because I'm like, how big is the dragon? Like, I don't quite. And so I thought it would be quite restrictive in that way. And in the end, it was amazing because it was so liberating, because you had no idea what was going on. And the bits of the film that I've seen, when you see it in that scale, it's kind of amazing.
Where did that beautiful singing voice come from on Les Mis? I mean, when you're singing Empty Chairs and Empty Tables, it's just such a great cinematic moment. Was that part of your acting training, or did you work with a coach beforehand? Where did that come from?
I didn't get cast as Workhouse Boy number 43 for nothing.
Wow.
You know, like, I mean, I've been considering myself for many a year. I loved singing as a kid. I've never been particularly good at it, but I've always enjoyed it. And then when I was at Cambridge, actually, I sang there. And then when I started working, in fact, I did a production of Cabaret at the Edinburgh Festival when I was about 18, which was the thing that really gave me the bug. And then I hadn't sung for many years. And what is amazing about when you get to do film generally is you get the most extraordinary support. And so I worked with a singing teacher called Mark Mayland for 8 weeks, who tried to iron out some of the problems, although you still see me in Empty Chairs and Empty Tables, the gigantic close-ups of going to try and get some vibrato out. But so I'm not sure it was all ironed through. But no, you get to work with amazing people.
Let's take a couple more questions from the audience. Yes, there.
Just love the film and your performance. But in addition to the physical and emotional challenges, having the 3 principals alive and available is John and Stephen and Jane. I know they visited the set, but it's kind of both a responsibility and a resource. Can you talk a little bit about how you navigated that challenge?
It was such a complicated relationship. It was the film was based on Jane's book. Jane is still married to Jonathan. Stephen is no longer with Elaine. Felicity and I wanted to meet them both early in the process, but because of their schedules, we could only meet them 4 or 5 days before we started filming. And what was complicated with that is because we weren't shooting chronologically, we had to chart in some sense certainly what the physical performance was going to be. and so the fear when you meet them is there's been this gigantic drum roll when you've watched every bit of documentary material, read as much as you can, and what if you're wrong? What if you meet them and you realize you've got everything wrong? Thank God, when I met Stephen, what I took away was not to do with, in some ways, with the specifics of anything physical. There were a couple of things he said that were incredibly useful, but really it was his spirit that you took away from meeting him. It's now very difficult for him to communicate. There are long, long pauses, but he just emanates this force of charisma. It's like all of the facilities that we have to communicate, of gesture, of vocal tone, of all of those energies are channeled into those very few muscles that he can use. So he has a sensationally expressive face, and his capacity for timing, this mischief, the kind of Lord of Misrule quality that he has, was really what I took away. From Jane and Jonathan, I mean, we went for dinner with them. I remember the first day of filming, literally seeing Jane arrive over the Cambridge, I think it was over a sort of bridge, on her bicycle, and she came. I was playing Stephen Young, and she came running up to me. She's like, "No, Eddie, his hair would be much messier than that." And she literally styled my hair, and that was an extraordinary thing. So there were sort of moments like that. But in some ways, one of the great keys for Felicity and I and Charlie were the Hawking children. Lucy and Tim, their youngest son, were wonderful to us, and they. Specifically Tim, I remember I spent all these months wanting to be absolutely authentic and rigorous to the disease and not wanting to, be in any way disrespectful. And I remember Tim saying, "Yeah, but we did use Dad's wheelchair as a go-kart." Or going, and we would put swear words into his voice machine and press play. And that was so, for us, that was just like, of course, this is a family living with the reality of this brutal thing, but living with great humor, and that was wonderful because it meant that I came running back to James and said, "Okay, we need a scene with the kids in the wheelchair or jumping over Stephen," and that really freed us up a lot.
In closing, tell us how you reflect on your dreams coming true. I mean, you were you're still the same starry-eyed little boy who stood on stage in Oliver, sort of loving acting, and then you came out to Hollywood. You were at the Standard Hotel playing ping pong with your mates, hoping to make it, and now you're riding the crest of a wave in awards season. As you stand on all these stages, clutching these well-deserved trophies, how do you reflect on the journey that you've been on?
A lot of pinching, basically. A huge amount of pinching myself, but also the fact that there are friends. I went to see Cabaret in New York 2 nights ago with Andrew Garfield, who's an old friend, and we started coming out here around the same time to watch his lady Emma Stone in Cabaret, and Cabaret was a thing at the Edinburgh Festival that I did and loved, and even getting to go behind the scenes there and see, it was just, it was electric. It reminded me of we did have a moment. That was the part that Emma wanted to play since she was a kid as well, and that of realizing just how lucky you are. I think it's almost sensory overload. It's too much perhaps to take in, but I'm trying to sort of mentally photograph it all so that I can look back and a couple of years ago remember quite how lucky I was.
Thank you for attending BAFTA Masterclass with a true new master of acting, Eddie Redmayne.
Thank you very much.